Mr. Putter and Tabby, toot the horn. 1. Loud music. Mr. Putter and his fine cat Tabby were neighbors to Mrs. Tea-Berry and her good dog Zeke. Mrs. Tea-Berry and Mr. Putter had a lot in common. They both liked bingo. They both liked free samples. They both liked rain. And they both liked music. Mrs. Tea-Berry liked country music the best. She liked the broken hearts. She liked the big zebra boots and the tall hair. Mr. Putter liked opera. He also liked broken hearts. And he liked the big round heroes and the violins. Some days, Mrs. Tea-Berry would play her country music very loud for Mr. Putter to hear. Some days, Mr. Putter would play his opera very loud for Mrs. Tea-Berry to hear. They liked sharing. One day, Mrs. Tea-Berry had an idea. "We should join a band," she told Mr. Putter. "But I can't join a band," said Mr. Putter. "I can play an instrument." "Of course you can," said Mrs. Tea-Berry. "Old people can do anything they want." "Can they say they can play an instrument?" asked Mr. Putter. "No," said Mrs. Tea-Berry. So she and Mr. Putter went to look for a band. 2. Toasties. Mr. Putter and Tabby and Mrs. Tea-Berry and Zeke went to hear many bands play. They went to hear an Irish band play jigs. But the jigging made Tabby nervous and Zeke itch, so they could not play in an Irish band. Next, they went to hear a brass band, but the brassy sound made Mrs. Tea-Berry's teeth hurt, so they could not play in a brass band. Then they went to hear a jazz band. The band plays very late in a club after midnight. Mr. Putter fell asleep, so they could not play in a jazz band. Poor Mr. Putter and Mrs. Tea-Berry. It seemed that bands were only for people who had low teeth and didn't need much sleep. They sat with Miss Tabby and Zeke and wondered what to do. 3. Mr. Putter can't. "I have it," said Mrs. Tea-Berry a few days later. She had brought Mr. Putter and Tabby some peach tea and a carrot pie. "We will be a band." "But I still can't play an instrument," said Mr. Putter. "Of course you can," said Mrs. Tea-Berry. "I can't," said Mr. Putter. "You can if you want to," said Mrs. Tea-Berry. Mr. Putter thought about Tabby's nervous and Zeke's itch and Mrs. Tea-Berry's teeth. He thought about a nap. "I'm not sure if I want to," said Mr. Putter. "If you try, I will bake you something sweet," said Mrs. Tea-Berry. "Sweet," said Mr. Putter. "Something really nutty," said Mrs. Tea-Berry. "Nutty?" said Mr. Putter. "With lots of vanilla," said Mrs. Tea-Berry. "I'm ready to play," said Mr. Putter. 4. Mr. Putter tries. The next day, Mr. Putter bought a little horn. He bought it because it was on sale. When he got home, Mr. Putter tooted the horn for 4 hours. It was a very bad tooter, the worst. Tabby went outside to sleep in the ferns. Mrs. Tea-Berry did not buy a horn to toot. She bought a mandolin. When he got home, she started plucking. She was a good plunker. She plucked all night long, and Zeke did not itch. By the next morning, Mrs. Tea-Berry could plunk her favorite country songs, but Mr. Putter could not toot his favorite songs. His tutor was holding up a tomato plant. 5. The band. Mrs. Tea-Berry forgave Mr. Putter for being a bad tutor. She said he could listen to her plunk instead, so he did. He listened to her plunk all the broken heart songs she could think of. He liked it very much. Tabby purred. Zeke did not itch. After the concert, they all had a sweet, nutty vanilla surprise. Mrs. Tea-Berry said Mr. Putter deserved it because he had tried. She said she did not mind being the only person in the band. She said the name of her band would be Plucking Without Putter. And they laughed and laughed and laughed. The end!